All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce Amir Haleem and Ariel Seidman. They're building some really interesting projects that have physical infrastructure interfacing with the crypto world. And that's a theme that we're really excited about. So I want to turn it over. Maybe, Amir, you go first. Can you both share a little bit about your backgrounds and how you ended up building in the crypto space?
Yeah, my background really nothing to do with either crypto or wireless networks. I spent most of my career in the video game space. I worked at a startup that ended up building Battlefield 1942, which was like this massive blockbuster game. Through my video game career, I met Sean Fanning from Napster, and we started scheming about building wireless networks. For some reason, I just felt like that was a good thing to do. And then we tried a lot of different ways to build Helium before we realized that building it with a crypto model or as a crypto economic model was the right way to do it. And there was lots of different moments down that path that sort of led us there. And I think actually, unfortunately, they're not in your portfolio, but the Filecoin white paper actually was one of the first times where the light bulb went off in my head. That was like, okay, that makes total sense. So Helium has taken an interesting path, and my background, not coming from this space or even from the wireless space, I think has actually been helpful because you look at it from a completely different lens, and you sort of ignore what you're supposed to know because you just don't, you don't know what you're doing. So it's been an interesting and fun journey.
So I started off at Yahoo back in the day, 2006, 2007 timeframe, when it was still kind of competitive with Google at the time. So I sat within the search group and I ran our maps group. And what I was watching happening was interesting and also deeply frustrating. So Google was investing just billions of dollars collecting massive amounts of data. Yahoo, for a variety of bad reasons, was not interested in playing that game. And we got our ass kicked, that's just the bottom line. And I was, pretty competitive person, was deeply frustrated with that. Said, geez, there must be a more cost-effective way to build a map. Make a long story short, I started a different company before HiveMapper called Gigwalk. It was this distributed data collection network with about 2 million users collecting data with their iPhones and Androids on behalf of everybody from Bloomberg Financial, World Health Organization, CPG companies. The company was never going to become really massive, so stopped doing that and then started the seeds of HiveMapper. And the seeds of HiveMapper was, okay, how do you truly build a global map? We started with drones, which was not a good idea, quite frankly. And the reason for that is just drones have really crappy battery life still, and there's a lot of regulation around them. And then we switched over to dash cams. And then that's really started to grow. And we started to be like, okay, there's something here that just scales and scales beautifully. And we'll get a little bit more into this, fundamentally, the financial business model that we had initially wasn't great. And that's when I came across Helium, got introduced to Amir, and was like, oh, this is super interesting. Can we apply this same kind of crypto concepts to actually incentivize the creation of this global map that we're building?
So Ariel, can you tell us a little bit more about how HiveMapper works?
Yeah, sure. So we're building this decentralized global map, and the way it works is quite simply. We have contributors, so they install this dash cam in their car, forward-facing or side-facing. It's a 4K dash cam. We take that video and we then transform that into this global map. And there's a couple of additional layers I'll get to in a second. So that's on the contributor side. Today, they're paid out in cash, right? So we broke the world up into these little tiles. And every time you map a tile, you get whatever, 1 cent or half a penny or something like that. As part of 2022, we're moving to a crypto model, as I mentioned, and we're launching a token that we refer to as Honey. On the other side are the customers, and the way that we serve our customers is through a series of mapping APIs. Today, the mapping APIs that we provide are quite basic, but over time, we'll add driving directions and geocoder and so forth. And so a lot of people don't realize this. Google Maps, in addition to serving you as a consumer, serves over 5 million app developers, right? So all the times that you see Google Maps embedded in a whole host and variety of applications, Underneath that is Google Maps, and they're paying Google Maps for using that API. So that's how we're going about it, and that's, we go into a lot more details. There's a lot more in terms of, at some point we'll kind of reprioritize drones so that we can get the above shot, add new sensors, because in addition to imagery, there's a whole host of kind of other sensor data that we would like to capture.
So I assume most of the audience is familiar with Helium, given we've talked about it quite a lot. It's been around, but perhaps for the few that may not be, can you explain Helium in your own words?
Helium is really like an economic model for building decentralized wireless networks, really born from the frustration of both sort of watching other wireless networks and how they're built and how they're operated, but also our own attempts to build a wireless network. When we started Helium years and years ago in 2013, our intention was just to build the network and just pay for it, right? Like we were going to build an IoT network and we were going to do it roughly the same way that everyone else builds networks, which is to pay for it yourself and try and recoup the cost as people use it. The new model of Helium that was launched in 2019 sort of completely changed that. It put the ownership of the network into people's hands, and so people often refer to Helium as the people's network. And that's what's so special about it. It's not just about providing incentives for people to create coverage, although that's a huge part of it. It's moving the whole economic model into people's hands and out of our hands or anyone else's hands. And that's been really powerful and profound. And people sometimes compare Helium to things that have happened in the past, like Fawn, or the Xfinity like shared Wi-Fi thing. But it's really nothing like that, right? It's not about a tit-for-tat model where I share my Wi-Fi and I get to use your Wi-Fi. I don't think anyone really cares about that. It's like enabled by default on like Xfinity routers, but otherwise, no, I don't think that's motivating for people. But Helium has been explosive in its growth. There's 370,000 hotspots on the network, and hotspots are like a combination of a crypto miner and a wireless access point for sensors. There's something like 3 million that are being manufactured. I think it's already the largest contiguous wireless network that has ever been built. It's certainly the fastest growing wireless network that's ever been built. And there's a lot more to come. This version of Helium is all about sensors and the Internet of Things, or IoT. But the next phases of Helium are going to be about cellular, they're going to be about fixed wireless, they're going to be about a lot of other types of like wireless infrastructure beyond serving sensors.
So something that I think is really interesting for both Helium and HiveMapper, and for both of you, is that you started your companies without thinking about crypto first. You tried like a Web 2 business model first. Can you tell us a little bit more about that transition and what that was like from the entrepreneur's lens? Like thinking like, oh, I found crypto, this is interesting, and like, now what do I do?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a shot at that first, I guess, just because it was so painfully seared into my memory. So our story is we had tried to build wireless networks ourselves and realized that was never going to work, right? It was like way too expensive to build them. Sensors were interested in paying like $1 a year or something, to use the network. There was like no way to make any kind of ROI make sense there. So we tried all sorts of different things. Like we started to become a company that made packaged like sensor solutions. Like here's a set of sensors that you can use to monitor like drugs in hospitals and things like that. That was sort of going okay. We raised the Series B that Google Ventures led in 2016. And it was probably 6 months after that we sort of decided that crypto was going to be the right way to do things. Like we had all read the Filecoin white paper. We had read like Mastering Bitcoin. Like we went on like a crash course about like what is crypto, which was kind of embarrassing in hindsight. And then the hard part after that was like, how do you convince your board and your shareholders after you've just raised like what was at the time a relatively large financing to do a different thing? And that was definitely hard. People thought we were insane, that it was just me being flighty and changing my mind, which I do often. And so that was by far the most complicated part of the equation, was trying to get buy-in from existing shareholders that had invested in a different thing. After that was a whole other set of complexity, particularly around like regulation and like how to like navigate through what you think the SEC wants and like how to like do all of that I think everyone in crypto at least that's based in the States, has had to navigate. Can't explain how time-consuming and expensive that is, and still is. It probably occupies 20-30% of my time on an ongoing basis. It's never ending. But that was really those two things I think were the hardest. Was really trying to convince everyone that this made sense. Like crypto was sort of a thing, but was kind of toxic. Like the ICO thing had just sort of boomed and busted, and people weren't sure what to make of it. And so, yeah. But I think we were fortunate to have a very good set of investors and board members that sort of understood that this could be a thing. But yeah, the regulation was definitely a thing that is incredibly painful and continues to be incredibly painful.
For us, well, maybe back up in terms of just looking at how maps get created, right? I think you got to understand that to kind of understand our thought process of how we ended up in crypto. So there's a couple of different approaches to building a map at a global scale. Most people don't realize this. There's actually really, truly maybe one global map, maybe 1.5. So there's Google Maps, which is definitely global by nature, and really does have global coverage. So obviously some places better than others. Apple Maps, to this day, does not have global coverage, right? In other words, it's not their own map. Okay, so you have the Google Maps approach, which is like crazy expensive. Literally, each of those Google Street View cars that you see is like $500,000 each. They go out, unbeknownst to a lot of people, they actually own a lot of airplanes. So that's the Google expensive approach, very, very, very centralized. Apple basically just did a copy-paste on that, and they're just throwing money at the problem. The other approach is unpaid crowdsourced, right? So the poster child for this would be something like OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap started in 2003 or 2004, didn't really get kind of the coverage necessary to serve most use cases until roughly like 2014, 2015. So that approach, while I think it has merit, just takes a really, really, really long time to actually do. And you're still ended up in the situation where you have coverage that's spotty, right? Like you have a very strong German community that has mapped, all these little interesting small German villages and towns, but isn't interested in, for whatever reason, El Salvador. And so you also have this freshness issue, right? Like, keeping the map up to date is really, really challenging. And if you're dependent upon this group, that's really hard to incentivize. The map kind of very quickly decays. And so I've tried actually all three of these approaches to a certain extent, right? The last approach is paid, right, crowdsourcing, where you're effectively paying people out. When you pay people out, that relationship becomes incredibly adversarial, right? What a company naturally wants to improve its margins over time, and so what do? They stop paying the contributors as much. And so guess what? The contributors understandably get really, really pissed off. And so when I started looking at Helium, I was like, ooh, this solves a lot of interesting problems. Right now, the contributors and the company or the network are on the same team, right? They own part of this. I think the other piece of this, if we just continue to pay people whatever, half a penny or whatever it is per map tile, and then Google or Amazon or whoever sees like, oh, that approach that HiveMapper team is doing is really, really interesting, we should duplicate that. Guess what? They can just pay, not a penny per tile. They can pay 20 cents or 50 cents per tile, right? And all the contributors would go there. But now with crypto, if you're actually own the tokens, and if you go and map for another network, you're effectively depressing the value of the thing that you've built ownership in. So you're going to think hard and long about that. So that was some of the thought process that we took, and then as I had a whole series of conversations with Amir, it really started, like the light bulbs went off of like, this could be possible. Now, internally at the company, there were definitely non-believers, right? Like this crypto thing is a scam. This is as of like, late last year, like, the crypto stuff is silly, it's stupid, it's overhyped, it's blah, 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 blah. And they naturally, like some of them left, or we actually like spun off this, or not, we sold off this piece of software that we were selling to another company, and some of the folks went with that divestiture. So at the end, we were left with this committed kind of hardcore groups because we had seen some really shitty, tough times, but you end up with this group that believes in it and loves it and enjoys building it. And so that's been very, very rewarding. In terms of our investors, Yeah, we have like 1 or 2 investors who's like, one of them actually just told me, he's like, this is a scam, you know, like I'm not into this at all. And, you know, but most of the investors are like, this makes sense, right? Like I think a lot of times as an investor, they see, oh, I want to apply crypto to blah, blah, blah project, and it doesn't make sense. And like our existing investors looked at our approach and they're like, no, 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 this actually makes sense. And so, you know, they're all along for the ride now.
You hit on a pretty interesting point there on building the map and having ownership in it.
Yep.
I think there's 2 really important aspects to that kind of lock-in that the contributors have. I think that there's this ownership aspect that you mentioned, but also the fact that, you know, there's some credible neutrality to the map. How do you think about the importance of credible neutrality, and like what does that enable that, you know, Google Maps can't do or someone else can't do?
Yep. There's 6 or 7 billion people in the world. It's one Earth. No one company owns the Earth. No one person owns the Earth. And so we think, and this is like when we talk about this internally often, is like we think it's really, really important for the people, you know, all of us who live on this Earth to own the map of that Earth, right? And so I think that's like a really important concept. And we think that a lot of other people also believe that in that idea, right? So now getting back to the kind of the crux of the question. So I think there's a lot of different lenses in which you can look at that from. So one is, let's start from a business perspective in terms of us going and selling to customers, right? If you go and sell to FedEx, right, or Uber, whoever it is, and you're a little startup, it doesn't matter. Like if you raise 20 million bucks or 80 million bucks or even 150 million bucks, they still view you as a relatively small startup. And if they're gonna trust a really, really key piece of critical infrastructure, their maps, their logistics information, right? The thing that make those businesses go oftentimes, to a little startup that can disappear tomorrow, that's not gonna like, you know, you're not gonna have career longevity at FedEx if you make those type of decisions, right? And so by saying to them, look, even if HiveMapper Inc. disappears tomorrow, there's still this mapping network that will continue to produce data for you. And oh, by the way, you could potentially go and get mapping APIs or build the mapping APIs yourself to, you know, pull all the data necessary. That makes that sales process that much easier for us as a company, right? And so I think that's a really, really critical point in the mapping world, which is, you know, these things are really, really tough to build. And B, like for the customers that really value this stuff, they don't want to risk it all on a little startup.
Amir, a question for you. This applies to both of you, but I think Helium has seen this recently, is because you're building in the physical world, that comes with some opportunities and some challenges, right? Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what it's like to scale a crypto project that touches the real world?
Yeah, I think this is, I mean, we've been fortunate we've been both fortunate and unfortunate. You know, the growth of Helium is sort of astonishing to watch. You know, it went from, I think, 20,000 hotspots, you know, less than 9 months ago, or less than a year ago, to like 360,000. But the unfortunate part is, I think, twofold. I mean, one is when you're dealing with hardware, so much is out of your control, right? There's a supply chain of components that is like impossible for you to manage, right? Like there's nothing you can do to like influence the supply chain in any way. And that's incredibly frustrating. And particularly in the case of Helium, where we use a technology called LoRa, it's all owned by one company, it's all manufactured by one company. That's a challenge. COVID made this infinitely worse, right? Like all of the supply chains for like everything were disrupted. And so that, I think for Helium, that has been the most disappointing part of our journey is that, you know, people, I think people even in this audience, you know, have bought hotspots and are still waiting for them, you know, like 8 months later or something like that, right? And that's really frustrating for us. And I think people can view that negatively as, you know, they view us negatively as a result of that. Even though it wasn't really our fault, it's just, you know, we are sort of the face of this, and it makes sense that people look at it that way. So that's for sure been the hardest part, is that when you're dealing with hardware, the supply chain and the sort of availability of components is completely out of your control. There are other real world things that are also really complicated, like wireless radio regulations, right? Like so every country has its own set of regulations about If you're going to operate a radio device in that country, it has to conform to this set of rules. Every country has a completely different set of rules. Some have like no defined set of rules, and some of them have multiple defined sets of rules, and you don't know which one to choose. And so how you sort of think about governing that at sort of a sort of blockchain level is like quite complicated. Like, do you just say we're going to ignore the rules and like make that the user's problem? Like, do you try and enforce the rules on chain, which is actually what we're doing now? You know, those are a couple of examples of things that I don't think a non-real world project ever really has to think about. And then you've got all sorts of weird stuff like HOA regulations, right? Like, you know, people get yelled at in their HOA, but there's an FCC rule that says you're allowed to do whatever you want with antennas in an HOA as long as it's to a certain altitude. You know, and so now people are in combat with their HOA as a result of like, you know, putting up antennas for helium. And so they're just, and it all somehow comes back to us when like people get upset. It's like I fought my HOA to put up this huge antenna and I'm only earning $800 a month. I'm like, come on. Like, seriously? So stuff like that is interesting and challenging and fun, but the supply chain stuff is real. And I think in hindsight, there are some things that we could have done differently. But COVID, I think, caught everyone off guard. In the semiconductor space, almost all semiconductor manufacturing happens in one place, which is at TSMC in Taiwan. And so they are incredibly backed up, building way more important stuff, you know, like M1 chips for Apple. And so everything is just sort of like, you know, at the back of the line, and there's no way of speeding it up. And so that stuff has been a shame. And I think the network would probably be 4 or 5 times the size if it weren't for some of that. But yeah, that's been hard.
Yeah, I mean, we started the year with 15,000 hotspots.
Oh, is that right?
It's 15,000. I looked it up recently. 360,000 today, roughly.
It's about, I think it's like 3,000 a day, 3,500 a day getting added right now. So it's definitely.
But the reason I like talking about these challenges is because I think these challenges are, like, as frustrating as they might be, actually a good thing. Because from like the investor perspective or a token holder perspective, right? Like, one thing that's really important in the world of crypto is that everything is open source. Everything is permissionless. And so where is your moat? Like, where is it defensible, right? And I think that when you have physical hardware that's hard to roll out, hard to get devices out in people's hands, hard to get hotspots or dash cams out into people's hands, that gives you something that we internally like to call unforkable state. It's something that someone could go and copy paste the Helium code base, but how are they going to get, 360,000 hotspots out there and another, 3 million? By the time they even get started, there's another 3 million that are shipped, right? So I actually think these challenges are a blessing in disguise when it comes to the long-term value capture and success of projects that touch the real world. I think something else that's really interesting about both HiveMapper and Helium and touches the real world is the communities. The people who are involved. Can you tell us a little bit more about these people and like just how they get introduced, the diversity of these people that are getting involved, whether they're first-time crypto users, and just tell us a little bit more about the communities. Maybe Amir, you can go first, and Ariel.
Yeah, Helium has actually been really interesting because I think is one of the biggest, so first it's one of the biggest crypto communities, I think. Like, we've got 130,000 Discord users and 75,000 subreddit members, and it's really big. But what's been really interesting is there's a lot of first-time crypto people. Like, the diversity of the membership is extraordinary, and that brings with it its own set of challenges. I think one thing that we did well with Helium was make it sort of relatively plug and play. Right? Like, you get the box, you press a button, you use a mobile app. Like, it's pretty straightforward compared to like trying to set up a validator or like mine Bitcoin or something. Both of those are kind of messy. And so that brought with it a group of people that was not used to crypto, didn't understand anything about it, which has been great, but also frustrating at times. Like, they're not used to things like, okay, well, if I lose my 12 words, like, we can't help you recover them, right? Like, there's no forgot password. And so I don't know how many hotspots and how much HNT is lost, to 12 words being lost, but it's going to be a decent number. But it's been a really interesting, and there's a bunch of like radio nerds in there, like ham radio guys, like people who just like I call them like telco anarchists, like guys that just want to kill AT&T and Verizon at all costs. There's like crypto guys in there. You know, it's a really interesting group of people. A lot of, you know, I think a lot of people, like now that HNT has sort of achieved a certain status, have like started to come from like other crypto projects, especially from the DeFi ecosystem. Like they're starting to understand like, oh, this is potentially another type of like yield generating thing, even though it's like kind of different. So it's a very diverse group. There's actually quite a lot of like ecosystem development going on. There's a pretty massive like set of apps that like interact with Helium that like analyze hotspot performance and like do all sorts of other things. But yeah, I think for me the most interesting part of it is that it's a very non-crypto audience. In a lot of cases, skews very old. You know, there's a lot of like 30+ people in there. In some cases, 50+ people in there. You know, who are just completely new to all of this that just would never have discovered crypto if it wasn't for a Facebook ad on Helium. You know, so
30 plus is old now.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. I'm old.
So our community is, we have kind of multiple modes of contribution. So the primary mode, which is what we're really focused on today, is through this dash cam. And we primarily focus on kind of two groups when it comes to the dash cam. One is, you know, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, delivery drivers, right? This really is interesting, people who are already on the road, right? Like if you're trying to make money and earn kind of passive income or, additional income through like going out just to drive with HiveMapper, that's like, we discourage people from doing that, quite frankly. And so the ROI for those folks, right, the Uber drivers, the Lyft drivers, delivery drivers is great. We also have another group which is like, there's a relatively large kind of mapping GIS geeky community that they love to just build maps, watch maps grow, annotate maps and stuff like that. So they actually go out and buy dash cams as well. What's interesting about that group is they like to turn it into like a game, like a challenge, right? So they're not just interested in like driving down like Broadway, right? They want to go into like all the little back alleys and all the like weird locations and stuff like that. So that's actually turns out to be really, really valuable in terms of building out global coverage, right? Like there's a lot of people who drive up and down Broadway. There's not that many people who go into all these like little nooks and crannies that are really valuable, especially for like logistics use cases and stuff like that. So then we'll add kind of another layer of contribution, which is like map annotators, right? And so they're the people actually being like, oh, here's the building boundary. Oh, here, that address is wrong. You know, that's a one-way street, all that kind of stuff. Unbeknownst to most people, Waze has that kind of map annotator. There's about 25,000 of them. I don't think they realize that Waze is owned by Google and they're actually working for a company that's like worth $2 trillion for free. Right? They just like spend hours and hours a day doing this kind of work for a company that's worth $2 trillion. So I'm very excited to like introduce HiveMapper to that community because I think that the economic equation is going to be a lot more rewarding for them. So those are the groups that we have today. Like little kind of quick funny story, like our best performing market right now, we're not in all markets, by the way. We're like only constraining to specific markets, kind of like the early days of Helium where they just focus on a couple key markets. Our best performing market is Manila. And it just turns out the community there is the thing that really made that market go for us, right? It was like the Uber driver who brought in his sister, who brought in the, somebody else who's like a delivery driver and like kind of spread within that community. And like they actually do like HiveMapper dinners every month and they get together and they geek out about like I got this road, no, I got that road before you and all that kind of cool stuff. So they send us pictures with their names on it, and we're like, oh, we don't want your names on your pictures. We're very like intent on keeping privacy.
So last question I have for you, and I'll turn it over to the audience, is I think one of the most exciting things about using crypto or blockchains to coordinate the type of economic activity that Helium and HiveMapper coordinate is cost reduction, right? It's just a massively lower cost. Can you maybe share some examples of use cases that this enables that were previously, like uneconomical, or other examples on how that cost reduction actually plays through the entire value chain and wasn't possible before?
Yeah, I think in Helium's case, IoT had been a thing that people had talked about since the sort of early 2000s, right? Like we were supposed to have like sensors everywhere that sensed everything, and we weren't supposed to have wildfires because we were supposed to be able to sense them early. And there was a lot of dreams about what sensing and IoT could have done. The challenge was sort of, as I mentioned before, it's like very expensive to build physical infrastructure. So as an example, like, a company like American Tower that like operates, cell tower infrastructure. They have like 40-something thousand sites. It costs them $5 billion a year just to like operate that network, right? Like not even to build a new network, right? Like just to keep that 40-something thousand operational. So if you think about it in that context, it's very expensive to build the networks, which means that the cost to use the networks also becomes really expensive, right? Like the only way to like possibly make that equation make sense is to pass the cost on to the users. And so part of what I think Helium has enabled is like bizarre use cases that were impossible, right, before. Like, so for example, we just announced this one company that is doing package delivery by drones, right? And they're able to like get the cost to be low enough because using the Helium network is practically free, right? Like it's fractions of a penny per byte sent. And so it's, those kinds of applications become possible when they were previously impossible. I think things that I still wish we had, like, wildfire monitoring become possible because it's possible to like blanket an entire, forest this way or something, right? And so we've seen all sorts of different use cases. I'm still most excited about everything to do with logistics, whether it's delivery by drones or whether it's, working with like package delivery companies. But yeah, it's all over the place. Like we've had a bunch of like roaming agreements recently that you may have seen where other companies that have tried to build their own IoT networks have just decided that Helium is big enough now that they're just going to start using the Helium network instead. And that's great for the network because those guys already have done all the customer acquisition, like they've got all the use cases. And so we've now got like Volvo and Costco and like Toyota and like all these major like corporations that are now using Helium as a result of like having gone through these roaming agreements. So again, it's just like, and for the network, for the other network, like they're happy because all of a sudden there's like way more coverage and their customers are more happy because their applications work more broadly. And so it just, and we'll do the same thing in cellular, and we'll do the same thing in like other wireless spaces where you can just change the cost structure in such a dramatic way that no one really can compete with you. You can't compete with that cost structure. It's impossible. And so that's, what I'm most excited about going forward is especially what we're going to do in cellular. I think is going to be relatively explosive. Like I don't think it will be possible for like a legacy infrastructure to keep up with what Helium ends up doing. But what we've already enabled in IoT, I think, is incredible, and we're starting to see use cases just come out of the woodwork that I don't think could have been built before.
For us, it's so if you take University Avenue in Palo Alto, right? Kind of Google's backyard. Google Street View cars see University Avenue anywhere between like roughly every 12 months, right? We can see that same street, literally every day, right? At the same, and still it would be orders of magnitude cheaper than running a Google Street View car, right? And so, in other parts of the world, by the way, it's like a lot worse, right? I mean, if you go to like Lagos, Nigeria, which is just like this massive city, like maybe every 36 months, right? And so what that does is it opens up a lot of opportunities for additional use cases, right? Like, I mean, you can understand from a commercial real estate perspective, traffic flows in and out of buildings, how stuff is changing, who frequents, the kinds of cars that are around there, all that kind of stuff. But the one that I'm actually most interested in seeing how this gets applied is AR, augmented reality, right? Because you have to augment objects, or you take a lizard and you put it on a park bench. If that park bench isn't there anymore, like the whole effect it kind of gets lost, right?